So today I will be talking about the synthesis and spectroscopic characterization of mixed uranium oxides at the nanoscale and some of the challenges that we face in characterization of these types of materials and what we're doing in development to try to get around some of these issues. And so as some context first, I wanted to say that this talk will be a little bit of a mixture of work that has been done both during my postdoctoral work at Lawrence Berkeley Lab. As Jerry mentioned, I was working with Corwin Booth at that time. And so my two main projects were related to spectroscopic characterization of actinide oxide nanoparticles in covalent organic frameworks. So I will talk about that work during a portion of this, as well as electronic structure characterization of lanthanide compounds. And that was mostly accomplished using XANES and Prof, so high energy resolution fluorescence detection, which I understand you've heard about before in the seminar series. So I will talk about how some of that work, in particular with the actinide oxide nanoparticles, also ties into what we are doing currently at Washington State University. So I'll talk a little bit about that as well. So I have started a research group there in July that really sits at the intersection between nanotechnology, X-ray characterization, and radioactivity. So that involves both actinide oxide particles as well as just radioactive activation of non-actinide particles as well. So I would say most of our progress to date has been made in the synthetic regime, just based on synchrotron travel not really being something that we could do at this time. So that's in part why I will also be speaking about what we've done previously at Berkeley Lab. So first, the motivation for why we would actually care to look at uranium oxides on the nanoscale. So uranium oxide, specifically UO2, is the primary material used in nuclear fuels. And it turns out that some of the issues that we face with, in particular, safety in nuclear fuels are related to release of fission products during nuclear reactions. And so what has been proposed is that if we can make these fuels smaller down to the nanometer length scale with the grains that they have, that we could have safer release of the fission products based on having a higher surface area with which that can happen, as well as be able to operate at higher burnup temperatures due to differences in thermal conductivity. So that has been proposed to be the case, but there really isn't a lot of work that's been done to actually explore how this would happen. Additionally, if we look at the back end of the nuclear fuel cycle and what happens if we had some sort of a contamination event within the environment, it turns out that uranium has a tendency to travel as colloids. And so understanding what happens with nanoscale uranium is also important from that aspect. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of work, as I mentioned, that has really been done in this area. So if we look overall at nanotechnology, which has now been such a buzzword for the last couple of decades, actinides have really kind of been left out of this mix. So just to give you some context for this, if we see how many studies have been done on a transition metal such as iron, we can see that we reach the tens of thousands. Something like gold nanoparticles, which we know were kind of the starting point for a lot of nanotechnology, hundreds of thousands. Whereas if we look at actinides, and in particular, uranium is the most common one that has been studied, we really are falling short for the amount of work that has been done. And even this number that's approaching 1,000 is very misleading because it mostly encompasses work that involves taking waste from environmental sites and then noticing that the particles are on the nanoscale, as opposed to systematic studies that try to understand the behavior of size-controlled particles. So those studies are really more in the tens. So there's really a lot of work that needs to be done. And in particular, we do see from the few studies that have been done that a lot of what we observe, as in other places on the periodic table, is different for nanoscale particles and also doesn't really follow predictable trends, even going across the actinide regime. So for example, if we take a look at a transition metal such as vanadium and we look at magnetic susceptibility, we can see trends that are changing in a way that is systematic and predictable. However, if we look at what little has been done in the actinides, we can see that not only are magnetic susceptibility trends not really making a lot of sense as a function of size, but also that we don't really have any observable trends at all based on only having discrete sizes of particles that have really been investigated. And so there's work that needs to be done in order to explain and to understand these trends. Additionally, some of our preliminary work has shown that we actually get different phases that sometimes arise on the nanoscale that don't actually exist in bulk structure. That's something that has also been observed in transition metals, but something that we'll need to understand if we want to be proposing these particles for the applications previously mentioned, since we know that the structure and properties of the materials are intimately related. So now I will switch over, and you'll see through this talk that we'll kind of go with the Berkeley Lab logo versus the Washington State logo, and that will give you some context for where this work was done so that that is properly acknowledged. So I would like to talk a little bit more about how we were approaching this problem at Berkeley Lab in my time there. So we were working on synthesis of uranium oxide particles and thorium oxide particles inside of covalent organic frameworks. And so by using a hard template, the idea of what this would allow us to do would be to control the nanoparticle size by assuming that their size would be confined by the pore size of the template. So we can think of that as like if you have kind of a sponge and you deposit precursor there, that you would have the particles only grow to whatever size those pores are at. And so what that allowed us to do was presumably control the size, to not have any sort of strong binding surfactant species, which can complicate pictures in colloidal synthesis systems. So because we need to stabilize the nanoparticle surface with organic ligands, as well as would enable microgram quantity synthesis, which isn't always something that we worry about so much in non-actinide systems, but if we want a sustainable way to look at actinide synthesis in systems that may span into transuranics, then we're going to need to come up with ways where we can reduce the amount of material that we use, so we reduce the amount of waste that's generated in our synthetic process as we test these things. So this is how we went about making the nanoparticles. So we took a precursor, a volatile precursor, in this case, uranium hexafluoroacac. And because that's volatile, what we could do is to incorporate that into the framework through subliming at low pressure. And then the precursor would then incorporate and become what we'll call an inclusion compound inside of the framework. Then based on heating, the precursor would decompose, and that decomposition resulted in the formation of nanoparticles. So this whole process can be traced by mass changes and color changes that we can see that this process has in fact occurred. So then we went through this process of comprehensive characterization, a lot of it X-ray based, and I'll get into why we care so much about X-rays when working with actinides in a little bit as I talk about taking the story a little bit forward. But so one of the techniques that was used was scanning transmission X-ray microscopy. And doing that through different elemental edges to see if in fact our actinide species were actually incorporated into the framework or if they were just somewhere else and just around the framework. So what the STXM mapping showed us is that in fact, we can see from the nanoparticle cases that yes, it appears that the uranium, as we can see in sort of this pink color, or thorium, as we can see in yellow, does in fact appear to be incorporated actually throughout the framework and not just kind of on the surface of the framework. We also see a reduction in the fluorine signal, suggesting that we had not really formed fluoride particles, which is something we were also concerned that may have happened in this process. So that gave us some indication that it seemed like we had particle formation. We also looked at transmission electron microscopy, which would be your typical kind of first case scenario for seeing if you actually had nanoparticle formation and trying to evaluate the size of the particles. And so from microscopy, it does appear that we have nanoparticles that are spread throughout the core as kind of these dark regions from bright field imaging, or from dark field imaging, the brighter regions. And we can see that they appear to be kind of distributed throughout this framework, which is in the less contrasted color. We can also see though that it's not really great to get microscope images in a system like this, because since the framework it's a two-dimensional framework, but it's stacked in 3 dimensions. And then those particles are on the micron scale. Well, to get good microscopy images, you really need things to be kind of 100 nanometers or less, because otherwise you can't focus any individual particle based on getting in the focal point. And so we had to come up with other ways to get better statistics on what the sizes of our particles actually were, because this method wasn't going to be sufficient from that. And that's really important because if we consider that nanoparticle surface percentage increases so drastically with smaller particle size, saying sub 5 nanometers is really not enough to really get a good idea of what's going on here, because for a 5 nanometer particle, that's about 16% surface atoms, but for a 1 nanometer particle, that's about 82% surface atoms. So we really get this large increase as we go down in size. And so for this, we turned to small angle X-ray scattering. And so what that allowed us to do, what we would think is that we could get potentially multiple things from small angle X-ray scattering. So one would be a form factor to determine the particle size, shape, and polydispersity. And so here I kind of have two simulations below the SAXS schematic, which shows kind of what we might expect if we had 1 versus 2 nanometer particles, essentially having different widths of the oscillations that can be modeled, as well as potentially a structure factor like diffraction peaks if there were particle spacing that were regular in any sort of way within our framework, which we thought may have been the case. As well as we may get some atomic structural information from the wide angle X-ray scattering region, which gives us information that would be very comparable to X-ray diffraction. And so we had a challenge there though, in that although we were at Berkeley Lab and we had a synchrotron right there, no one had ever measured radioactive materials at the beamline. And so we had to be the first ones to convince them to let us do this and take our radioactive materials there. And so that was a little bit of a challenge, but we were able to do that. So what we ended up doing was mixing our solid state samples with boron nitride, placing them into quartz capillaries, placing those capillaries inside of Kapton tubes, and then sealing those into larger holders. Well, unlike with XAFS, where we have element specificity, and so we can put things inside of containers, and that is not really a problem unless we have too much absorption through whatever that is, or there are competitive species. With SAXS, everything scatters, and so we had some difficulty with the backgrounds that we got from having a system like this. And even if we didn't have a system like this, we still have the framework, which in and of itself is going to provide quite a background. And so I developed a code that we used in order to extract the form factor from the system with a complicated background through using fitting in linear combination with backgrounds that we were able to take separately. And so from there, we were able to simulate a form factor and extract that form factor from this more complicated signal, which includes diffraction peaks from the COF. We didn't actually see any diffraction peaks from interparticle spacing being regular, suggesting that that really wasn't the case, although we thought maybe it would be. And we also didn't see any diffraction peaks from the nanoparticles themselves, which we also had not seen via X-ray diffraction, just based on having particles that are so small that the shear broadening is huge. And this made sense. So as we look at a Schultz distribution of the particle sizes, it does appear that the nanoparticles are confined in their size based on the COF pore size, as we can see kind of on the bottom right distributions that are plotted out here, and that the nanoparticles are in fact quite small. So they are sub 2 nanometer in their size on average and exhibit a polydispersity that is relatively high, and that's not really uncommon for very small nanoparticles. And so that was able to give us statistics about the particle size, but still doesn't tell us really anything about the atomic scale information. Again, we couldn't really get that from X-ray diffraction, so we turned to X-ray absorption spectroscopy in order to look at that. And so we both looked at the inclusion compounds as they were incorporated inside of the COF, so just getting that precursor inside of that framework, and that's what we're showing in the plots that are on the left here. I have Zanes at the top and then the XAFS Fourier transforms on the bottom. And what we were basically getting out of this is that these signals are not very different. And in fact, if you fit, everything is within error between the inclusion compounds and the initial precursor. And so what this suggested is that we weren't really seeing any change in the precursor structure upon incorporation inside of the framework. So that suggested to us that we could still have decomposition of the precursor, that it hadn't pre-decomposed upon incorporation. We also did do, I'll talk a little bit more about Debye analysis, but it did not seem that the structural disorder was also greatly perturbed upon incorporation into the framework. And then also we took a look at the nanoparticles and compared them with their bulk oxides. That's what we're trying to learn about here, right, is how the nanoparticles might behave differently from bulk. And so we looked both at the XANES and the XAFS, and I'll go a lot more into the XAFS analysis. But for the XANES, interestingly enough, we didn't necessarily see the same trends if we compare, uranium versus thorium. Generally, I'm used to seeing, since we're looking at the L3 edge here, that based on differences in surrounding potential, that you exhibit generally a higher white line for the case of nanoparticles as you would for molecules. That's not what we saw in the case of thorium. Other people have also reported seeing this difference before, where we don't see that increase in the white line for the case of thorium. We also do see that there's a shoulder that somewhat disappears, and that has been attributed in previous work to be related to simply having a lack of long-range systematic ordering. So from the XAFS region, we can see that the peak amplitudes are greatly decreased. And so we will go into the different competitive factors as to why that might be the case and how we were able to explain that. So our main question here, we can look at the thorium case, we look at the uranium case. In the thorium case, we can essentially see that there's basically no second shell at all. And in the uranium case, the second shell is very decreased. The first shell is also very decreased. This is not necessarily uncommon in the case of nanoparticles, but there's more competitive factors, I would say, in actinides that could contribute to this than necessarily in other systems. So in particular, one of the competitive things here is that in the case of uranium especially, there are multiple stable higher oxides of uranium that could also potentially be present in our system. So for example, here I compare the nanoparticle spectrum on the right with a simulation of U409. And U409 is a very disordered-like structure where especially our first shell bond distances are essentially all different. We have many different uranium sites. And so essentially that completely dampens out all of our signals. So one of our questions is kind of, well, maybe do we have some combination of higher oxides? Is that causing us to have these dampened contributions, or is it something else? We know in the case of nanoparticles that if we have a high percentage of surface atoms, that we may expect to actually observe there to be a decrease in coordination number based on having dangling bonds at the surface. That also would cause decreases in the peak intensity. And we did in fact observe, if we compare bulk to the nanoparticles, that in both the first and second shell, we saw a great decrease in the coordination number, as may be expected for these cases. Also though, we saw very large increases in the sigma values. And so we took a greater look at that in this case as well. So what we did is we took data at multiple temperatures for all of these samples, the inclusion compounds, precursors, and nanoparticles, and did some Debye analysis. In this case, we were using an Einstein model to separate. We did also use a correlated Debye model and compared both of those. We didn't really see any difference, as would be expected in those models, in the extracted structural disorder. It's really just the Debye temperature that is a multiplicative factor difference in those models. But what we see here is that the structural disorder extracted from the nanoparticles is in fact quite appreciable, as we were able to find from this. So what this showed us is that generally we attributed most of the peak amplitude decrease to structural disorder. And so just some summaries from this particular study before I'll take a break for questions. So one is that radioactive materials in the nanoscale are important for nuclear fuels in multiple parts of the nuclear fuel cycle, but are not very well understood. So we mentioned that there's not a lot of studies that have really been done on these materials. Also, we were able to show that using COF5 as an inert template, we could make ultra small actinide oxide nanoparticles, and that these can serve as analogs to study properties resulting from decreasing grain size in actinide materials. We did not see really any strong binding from surface ligands based on the atomic scale structure that we were investigating. We also suggested, based on our initial analysis, that we have particles that are ANO2 in their formulation based on being able to fit them with bulk UO2 or THO2 pathways alone, but I'll get more into that in how we're taking this forward. As well as the fact that the decreases in the XAFS peak intensities, well, there were multiple things that could have possibly contributed to that. We attributed that mostly based on our Debye analysis to increased structural disorder compared to the bulk case. So with that, I'm happy to take some questions at this time.
Thank you. That's a great first section. A lot of interesting stuff. First question is from Carolyn Pierce.
Thanks, Jerry. Thanks, Liane. Yeah, fascinating. It's really beautiful work. I was just curious about when you talked at the beginning about the number of references related to actinide nanoparticles. Does that take into account theoretical studies as well? And are there any theoretical studies that could explain those strange trends that you were showing?
So there are some theoretical studies. I would say there hasn't been a lot of theoretical work as well. This is something I've talked about in considerable depth with Ping Yang from Mo's lab, who's been interested in nanoparticles for some time. And in particular, I think the lack of that is because there aren't necessarily the experimental studies at this point to be comparing to. And so that's kind of what has been, there are definitely theorists, I think, that are very interested in this area, or at least that has been portrayed to me by the theorists. But that it's really kind of, we need experiments for them to be able to also look at some of this with. So I think that will kind of come hand in hand. But I think there has been work on UO2 surface chemistry in particular and higher oxide surface chemistry that is more representative in the literature, not so much on nanoparticles themselves, although there are some studies on some nanoscale theory in particles.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll remind everyone to put their questions in the chat, please. We've got one. Brandy, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, I was wondering, increased structural disorder, does that suggest the atoms aren't really aligned in rows and so they're sort of behaving more as though they're amorphous, or is it referring to something different than that?
Sure, so I'll get into this a little bit moving forward in some other simulations that we've done in comparison to clusters, which are in fact crystalline, however relaxed and not kind of in rows. I think one challenge within these systems is that we can actually, if we get good enough microscope images, and I didn't show them here, see lattice fringes. So that generally would suggest that your structure is crystalline. However, with electron microscopy, the high local heating you get under the electron beam can sometimes induce increased crystallinity that you don't otherwise see. So I would, my interpretation is that in fact, the atomic positions are relaxed. So I do view these as being more amorphous-like. I know that my synthetic collaborator would probably not like the fact that I'm saying that because he likes to think of them as crystalline, just not having atoms exactly in rows, if you will. To me, that also kind of defines amorphous. So I would interpret that they are amorphous-like.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay, last question from Satish Maneni.
Yeah, pretty nice talk. I'm just looking at your STXM data and your Zane's XAFS data. And the STXM data shows like you have a lot of carbon, fluorine, and so on in the nanoparticles. And I'm wondering how pure these how pure are these?
Sure, well, the carbon, fluorine, all of these things are from the covalent organic framework. Well, the fluorine itself is from the precursor, right? So but carbon, oxygen, and are both species that are present in the covalent organic framework, which are still there. We've never taken the particles outside of the framework, so we attribute the fact that that is there to not being something that's present in the particles, but rather just being because the COF is there. It's actually really difficult to create uranium carbide. That was something that we looked into if that were a possibility, but it was one that we didn't really see any evidence for structurally, and actually would have been really cool if we could make that, but it didn't appear that we did. And then as far as fluorine, we did kind of question, well, it does seem that there may be some residual fluorine. However, the level has greatly decreased in the amount. I mean, these are all kind of scaled. So it's difficult to make direct comparisons, but we can see that actually the fluorine is essentially completely gone in the case of the UO2 nanoparticles at CAF. So that suggested that we didn't in fact have fluorine incorporation still. It wasn't completely gone in the case of the thorium. And that could suggest that there may be some fluorine that has stuck around. We're trying to look into that, but that there didn't appear to be evidence of fluorine incorporation into the particles themselves. In particular, in the SI of the paper, we do show the fluorine data from the XAS that was taken in conjunction with STXM. And from interpretation of that, it did not appear that there was really incorporation inside of the particles from the fluorine.
Thank you. Another quick question, if there is time. From your XAFS, you have at least the nanoparticle shows some structure up to about 5-ish angstroms. And your particle size is, the average size is about 1.2-ish or 1 nanometer, somewhere there, right? So I'm wondering, do you think that the outer maybe few angstroms is all disordered? Or so how do you think the structure propagates as you go from the core to the outside?
Right, so that's something that is interesting, and I won't talk about that today, but one thing that we've looked at subsequently is making particles of different sizes using this methodology to see if there is some sort of, kind of disordered core shell structure going on within this case. We also did some comparison, I didn't talk about this either, trying to map. It's not really a great model because we don't have a totally identical symmetric system here, but we did use the method developed by Calvin to look at particle decreases in coordination number as a function of size. And it did appear that there were some trends that suggested that the disorder should potentially be, we at least attributed it to being greater as we go, outward towards the surface, that there is kind of this decrease, especially in the second shell, because the particles are so small, in seeing kind of this second shell behavior. But it can't all be attributed to that. And we've subsequently done Debye analysis on the second shell too, and there are definitely appreciable structural disorder contributions there as well.
Thank you.
Okay, you should continue, Liane.
Sure, thank you. And thanks everyone for your questions. I appreciate that, they're really good. So now I would like to kind of switch gears a little bit and talk about what it is that we're working on in my group at Washington State subsequent to that study. And I think that they're not entirely separate. We're still doing, not all of our work is on uranium oxides, but we are still doing work on uranium oxides. And so I've kind of dedicated myself to trying to think about solving some of the issues that we had with the XAFS analysis in order to try to simplify some of our work moving forward with all of these complicating effects. And so there are kind of 3 different ways and routes in which our group is currently trying to work on development of these particles as multiple sizes. I think that the COF method was really powerful. However, covalent organic frameworks are only so large in the pore sizes you can get. Actually, COF5 is one of the largest that exists. So if we ever wanted to look at kind of the size regime that's between bulk and 2 nanometers, we need other methodology to use. And so that's kind of where we've been looking at different methods. I think no one method allows us to solve all of the problems that we're trying to look at. So I think the covalent organic framework method's really good because we don't have these strong binding surface ligands. We're able to do everything in the solid state. So we don't have kind of the solvent interactions that may complicate pictures. And so for that though, we're also looking, so we've extended the work, we're doing other work with the covalent organic frameworks, we're still involved with the work, collaborating with the folks at Berkeley Lab and doing XAFS analysis related to their systems as they move forward with the project I just talked about. So my student has been analyzing some of those systems, but also we are working with some metal organic frameworks as well in collaboration with a group that specializes in growth of metal organic frameworks at Washington State. But for actually getting things that are larger sizes, especially if we think about the nuclear fuel cycle, In high burnup structure, we get grain sizes more on the order of 100 nanometers. And currently there aren't really methods to make particles kind of in sort of that size regime. And so for that, we've been turning to solution colloidal-based synthetic methods. There have been a couple reported to make particles of kind of a 6 nanometer route. And having a background in transition metal synthesis, I found that actually there's a lot of similarities in the types of approaches that we can employ. So we've been working on some of that area as well. And then also, neither of those systems, I should mention, because of kind of these higher oxide complications, pretty much everything that we do is in very controlled, inert atmosphere, because we can't, once the particles are exposed to air and water, uranium has a tendency to want to be uranium-6 instead of uranium-4. And so as a result, we might expect higher oxides to form. And so we have also developed ways to start to look at aqueous systems. So we're also running some electrochemical synthesis and electrochemical reduction of uranium to form particles that should be better to look at more environmentally relevant systems. And so the general approach that we're taking, as was taken before, is to really try to pair the synthetic processing with characterization on multiple length scales in order to really understand kind of the entire material science tetrahedron here, where we connect all of these different dots to get ultimately a larger picture of what's happening at the nanoscale. And I really think that what I've tried to do in establishing the group that I have is pairing the X-ray expertise that I have developed over a number of years with the synthetic expertise, because I've also been involved in that piece of the work. So I've started a group where people are doing both things. I really think that to do good atomic scale analysis, it's very important to have a chemical knowledge of the systems that you're working with. And so the idea is that the students will be making the systems that they're also analyzing. But as we saw a little bit about before, I would like to highlight the different issues that we really start to see when it comes to working with uranium oxide. So we have what I would like to call 3 key problems that are needing to be solved moving forward. So one is the radioactive problem. We are working with radioactive materials. It turns out that a lot of people don't really like you to put radioactive materials on their instruments because you contaminate them. And so this is something that we have to work around. Another is the nano problem. So as I mentioned, a lot of times these particles are so small that shear broadening precludes any sort of structural analysis using conventional bulk techniques such as X-ray diffraction. So that's why XAFS has been so important for us. Then also there's the uranium problem, which is, I love showing this picture because the early actinides are just so rich in their electronic structure and the possible oxidation states that they can access. And uranium is really one of the big key ones here. As I mentioned, in water-based or air-based systems, uranium-6+ is going to just be the dominating species, but uranium-4 is also quite stable. In fact, it's not included here, but we have other inorganic synthesis folks in the community who are making uranium of lower oxidation states than 3. So really, we have this redox structure that is incredibly variable. We have many stable possible uranium oxides, and so figuring out what it is that we've made can sometimes be a little bit challenging. And so I'm going to go through kind of these different problems sort of one by one. So one of them here is the radioactive problem. And this is one that X-rays really come to our rescue because we can contain the materials that we are working with because X-rays will penetrate through them. And in particular, that's helpful with XAFS because since we are element specific, that means that we can go ahead and penetrate through containment layers. So for uranium, generally 1 layer of containment at certain synchrotrons is enough, but in other actinides, it's generally standard, and sometimes it's standard also with uranium, depending on where you're at, to actually have 3 layers of containment. So we have a number of cells. I know at Berkeley Lab, I developed a couple that are kind of at the top. One was for looking at different pH liquids, and another for the small angle X-ray scattering, but there are a number of different strategies that have been employed and approved in the past for measurement of the radioactive materials. So for X-rays, in some cases, we've kind of solved this problem to an extent. I'll add that we've done work with even more radioactive isotopes. Most recently, a paper was published coming out of the Berkeley Lab group that I was involved with related to measuring Einsteinium at the synchrotron. So we can actually, go ahead and look at some of these previously unmeasurable materials because we can actually contain them. And if we couldn't contain them and have the sensitivity that the synchrotron gives us, we wouldn't really be able to study their structures at all. So that's the radioactive problem. It's still a problem. We still need to figure out better ways to contain materials, but to some extent that's solved. There are things that we can in fact do. Then though, there's the nano problem, which is not just specific to actinides. It's generally a problem that persists, which is that for very small nanoparticles, XAFS amplitudes are suppressed. As I mentioned in the case of the Prof system, this can happen based on having multiple different effects, that there are surface termination issues, that there are structural disorder issues, and then, potentially higher oxidation issues or different structures that are occurring. So I really think that out of these problems, the nano problem is a big one. And so some things to take away from this a little bit are things that we're still thinking about. So reduction in amplitude, it can be caused by all these different things, as I mentioned. Luckily, if we do take measurements as a function of temperature, we can separate the thermal and structural disorder, which is really, I think, useful for us in being able to figure out kind of which of these things is contributing to these decreases in intensity that we see in the signal. But I think what's still, if we look back at the previous work done at Berkeley Lab, I think the highest criticism that we got based on that work is how do we know that we had UO2? And I think that there are three different conclusions or ways that we really came to that conclusion in particular. I think if you take a look at the supplementary information of that paper, it's basically me running a bunch of XAFS simulations and arguments related to why we thought that it was UO2. So it's a little bit interesting to take a look at. But the three main reasons were that the uranium oxide particles followed similar trends as the thorium dioxide. Now, thorium dioxide doesn't have all of these same rich electronic structure things going on that uranium does. Thorium really likes to be thorium-4. And so thorium doesn't really form other oxides. It should be thorium oxide. So the fact that they followed similar trends suggested to us that probably we had uranium dioxide. Also, we did find that there was appreciable structural disorder separating the structural versus thermal disorder, and we didn't really see any statistical evidence of shorter bonds that would be associated with U5 or U6, which would be present in some of the higher oxides that we would expect. So those were the reasons that we gave, but I think that it's really going to be something that we need to really hone in on and be more confident about moving forward if we're going to be spending a lot of time looking at uranium oxides on the nanoscale. So one of the things that I mentioned is that when you asked about the whole crystallinity question is it turned out also we ran some simulations related to whether clusters could serve as standards to consider actinide surface chemistry and what's happening. So if we take clusters, so there are a couple of different uranium-38 clusters where the center is really a more ideal UO2 that's stoichiometric, and then there's relaxation of the uranium and oxygen kind of going out towards the surface, and these are oxo-hydroxy clusters. So they are in fact U4. But we see if we take the ligands off of these clusters and just look at the interior structure, that actually we are able to fairly well reproduce what we're seeing with the nanoparticle case when we run FEF simulations, averaging over all of the different sites that we see in these clusters. And so potentially this actually is a pretty good way to explain and mimic what we are seeing in the case of these ultra small nanoparticles. And that seems to, if we compare that to simulations we ran with different higher oxides, it seems to match quite a bit better. So is it possible that there may be some higher oxide incorporation? Maybe, but if so, it's likely not the majority phase, that we think that this other relaxation at the surface may be a better way to describe that. And again, so here's comparing kind of those two different models. So it seems like the cluster model is really a better way to explain what is going on in that case. However, there are also competitive effects that might occur based on higher. So I'd like to distinguish the fact that it's possible we're initially forming oxides of different composition versus you take your sample to the beamline, and in that process, oxidation happens. So these are things that can both possibly complicate the process, but there has, I would say, at least in the case of bulk species, for example, a body of work that has already accumulated related to higher oxide incorporation based on oxidation processes within uranium and plutonium. A lot of that work pioneered by Steve Conradson. And so if we take a look at those types of systems, we can see that uranium has a tendency to form oxidation at surfaces that kind of follow a oxygen incorporation model where the oxygen would incorporate into interstitial sites. So this is something else that we would need to look into potentially in the systems that we would be looking at. And so what all of this tells us is that an understanding of nanoparticle structural attributes is going to rely on well-developed analysis techniques and standards that are going to let us really figure out what is happening in our system and deconvolute all of these complicating factors that could potentially be affecting our spectra. And so from part two, a couple of different things. So one is that our thought is that no one synthetic approach is going to solve all of our problems, that we need to develop other ways to be able to look at systems that might be related to water, systems that might be of different sizes. And so synthetically, that's where a lot of our efforts are going to be going moving forward. Also, uranium oxide is difficult to characterize. We've got the redox problem from having multiple stable oxidation states. We have the radioactive problem, and then we also have the nanoscale problem, which is also difficult. And so I would also say that despite our conclusions in the nanoparticle at COF paper, which were the best that we could make at that time, we are not entirely satisfied moving forward that higher oxides are not always present just because we could fit a spectra using only bulk pathways. And so the cluster-based models and disorder do suggest that this higher oxide incorporation is not the case, but we really need to look into this problem further, and that will kind of make up the last portion of my talk after a second question break.
Okay, there's a few questions, but I think why don't we hold them until you're done? I think we're on a good pace.
Sure.
Okay.
All right, so if we are going to continue working with uranium oxide, the outstanding question that we have here is, to what extent can we be confident in the phases that we are assigning to the nanoparticles? So our results from before, again, don't really support that we have higher oxide formation. That doesn't mean that it's not there, but our results don't directly support it. But the question stands as to whether we did have incorporation of higher oxides that is just below the detection limit. And that takes us to a more fundamental question of what is the detection limit for higher oxides of uranium within UO2 that can be determined using XAFS? And I think that this is a problem that a lot of folks face for a lot of different types of systems. If they have some sort of mixed system that they're looking at, how confident can we be that we have a single phase structure? And so this led me to think about, well, how are we approaching this right now within the XAFS community? So conversations with Corwin and other XAFS researchers about kind of what can we expect for how well can we figure out if there are higher oxide phases or some secondary oxide phase within one majority phase. And generally, there was a number thrown around of about 10% is the likely value. Now, unfortunately, informal conversations are not a systematic study and not something that we can cite. So like we couldn't say in the nanoparticle at COF paper, there may be up to 10% incorporation of a higher oxide. That number could be higher, that number could be lower. We don't know. There are some studies that kind of quote error bars on coordination number as being how we can determine whether or not a secondary phase has been incorporated. But I'm not really sure that that's the best way to do that, because we know coordination number is not a particularly accurate metric by which to look at XAFS data. It's not as accurate as some of the other parameters really are, and doesn't necessarily tell us the existence or non-existence of a particular phase. And so also, thinking about this, there certainly isn't going to be one number in figuring out kind of what is a detection limit of a secondary phase. This would have to depend on parameters such as differences in the spectral features of the phase. So are two phases very different from each other, or are they very similar structurally to each other? Also phase disorder. Do we have one structure that's very crystalline, one that's disordered? How does that affect the picture? Also data collection ranges. We know if we're actually at the synchrotron, we may take data to very far distances and to very far ranges of K, or maybe our system limits us into we can't go quite as far in K as we would like. Also data quality, right? We may have systems that are very dilute that are limited. And so that I'm sure also will affect the picture. So we have kind of these systematic system issues and then also measurement issues that are probably going to affect what we're looking at here. And so thinking about this too, you know, I'm really approaching this from the XAFS region of the spectra as opposed to XANES, and in particular because of the fact that if we take a look at XANES and just kind of differences in potential oxidation state, well, you know, maybe that's something that could be more useful for bulk structures, but if we look at nanoparticles, potential differences often complicate spectral features, as we noticed in our nanoparticles. So I don't think we can necessarily say, is this a nanoscale effect or is this a higher oxidation effect in all cases? Now, this is something that I know that Christina Kvashina previously gave a talk in this series related to M-edge HERFT, and I think that would be a much better way to go about doing some of that sort of analysis, which is something that we're also interested in. But I would argue that the XANES edges are not really sensitive enough for us here to be able to make these assignments solely based on that. So here instead is the approach that we've thought about taking. So to use simulations in order to separate contributions from oxide species, percent incorporation, disorder, and data quality, because those are things that we can separate using simulations. But then also to experimentally mix known quantities of bulk uranium oxides that are well characterized using X-ray diffraction and Raman spectroscopy, because once we are with bulk samples, now we can actually characterize them using more conventional tools to serve as standard experimental samples that we could then potentially compare and answer this higher oxide question with. So then the idea would be to try to fit the resulting simulation and experimental spectra using only single oxide versus mixed oxide pathways and quantify at which phase percentage those pathways from a mixed oxide statistically contribute to the fit. And that would then be done using statistical tests. So how can we see whether or not we statistically can say that there's a higher oxide or not, even if we know that it's present based on having a known bulk system? When can we draw that line using XAFS? And then the idea is that we could use these systems then as standards and try to use that to kind of figure out a range based on different structures, what the detection limit would be to better characterize experimental unknowns for our synthetic systems where we don't, unlike these bulk systems, know the answer as to what that phase percentage is using a combination of other techniques. And so for this, you'll note that I shared another paper besides our own publication. And I think that this is something that thinking about statistics and determining what to include or what not to include in an XAFS fit is something that I learned during my postdoc that I think is one of the most useful things that I learned at that time in expanding my knowledge of XAFS data analysis. And the reason for that is because we have so many different parameters and variables that we deal with when we're doing XAFS analysis, the question I think does come up as to, is this real or am I oversampling? Even if we're kind of within the threshold of number of variables versus independent points that seems to make sense to us. And so what we can do is use a statistical F.test to compare threshold values and consider whether or not the added pathway statistically contributes to a fit. And so I'd like to give an example of, we did use this, for example, in the nanoparticle at COF paper. And so here's an example that I'd like to show for that. So if we took a look at our thorium dioxide nanoparticles in the COF versus the fit. So we can see that there's really not visibly a second shell there. So the question was, do we include a second shell or do we not include a second shell in this fit? Because if we actually ran a fit, we did in fact see that the second shell seemed to be caught, as in the distance that a peak was found to be the second shell without fixing anything, actually did show up at the same distance that we would expect the thorium-thorium shell to be in bulk. So what we did is we ran a statistical test, as I mentioned on the previous slide, to see whether or not statistically adding that second shell contributed sufficiently to the goodness of fit to include it. And in fact, it did not pass the threshold. So we included this kind of with the caveat that we can't really say that that second shell is there statistically. So this is the same principle that we would think to then apply to some of these mixed uranium oxides to see whether or not we can actually detect that that oxide exists and define a threshold based on that. Even if we know that that oxide is there, can XAFS find that it is there? And so we have an active proposal to pursue this problem. Unfortunately, right now, only low-risk remote remeasurements are currently allowed at SSRL, and radioactive work is unfortunately not considered low risk. So we have not been able to actually look at this using experiments yet, although we have plans to do so. But we are able to run simulations, at least, to get an idea of what samples to best test. And so what I have been spending some time doing is running simulations of various oxides and various percentages of oxide compositions as they are mixed with each other. So taking some uranium oxides, the most stable ones are known to be UO2, U409, and U308. However, on the nanoscale, we don't necessarily know that that is the case. That is the case in bulk, but all of these oxides technically exist. And so we would explore all of them. Also looking at the range of data collection in K, because we mentioned that that could potentially be complicating this picture, as well as the degree of disorder. So do we neglect disorder altogether? And then varying the Debye temperature in simulations also to see if we can change that a little bit. And then also looking at data quality, so adding in noise and seeing how that affects this picture as well. And in cross combination, this involves many different simulations, not including the fact that we're averaging over multiple sites in all of these structures. So this is really a thorough investigation that we're trying to look at, simulation oriented, to limit kind of the number of experiments that we would run within the system. So on this slide, I've kind of just put out there some of the different oxides and their structures that we are in fact looking at, and we can see that they are in fact all distinct different oxides that we have here, but the structures are more or less similar to each other or not similar to each other. We can also see if we take our oxides and convert them into what we would expect for an average first shell coordination number and bond length, if we considered all of the bonds to be an average together, and static disorder, what those would look like. And we can see that we should observe some differences between them. This was another argument as to why we thought our initial particles were UO2, was also looking at what we would expect to see in a single shell fit for these different structures. And so here I have just kind of plotted out what the spectra of these different oxides look like, but I'll also go through kind of what we saw when we incorporated different levels of them into UO2. But what we can see is that they are distinct, but some of them are more similar than others. So if we take a look, for example, at UO2 to U409, and what I've really tried to do is kind of emphasize the lower incorporation limit, because we would think that that might be more representative towards a detection limit, but maybe not as we look at some of these structures. And we can see that U409, if we look at the real space phase, is not very different from UO2, which is going to complicate our picture quite a lot in distinguishing between these oxides, if we can at all. I think U307 is even worse, despite the fact that U409 is structurally, if you look at that, quite similar to UO2 in many ways. It also turns out that U307, based on how the amplitudes combined, does in fact show up at, there are slight differences in phase in these cases, but not very appreciable. Whereas something like U205, we can see that there are greater differences, which should help us a little bit more in the phase. U308 is really an example where we can see that there are definitely appreciable differences in both the first and second shell, that this might be a structure where we can get a greater differentiation and expect to see a detection limit that is quite different. As well as, UO3. In this case, we also see some similarities in some of the phases. So we can see too that it's there are some similarities structurally independent of the amount of oxide incorporation that we might expect to see. So we've been running, and as I mentioned, differences in the amount of information we have, so differences in the K ranges that we're looking at. And I should mention that when we're looking at nanoparticle samples, often you don't get very good data beyond a value of K equals, if you're lucky, 14. So we are often kind of limited in the ranges that we can maybe look at, but we do suspect that this might affect those pictures as well. So I'm not showing kind of everything that we've done so far. In particular, this is something that, you know, is still a work in progress. It's something I don't necessarily want to share too much about before it would be published also. However, these are the things that we're, you know, starting to think about within these systems, and our simulations are guiding the data that we would take experimentally to really go through and do all of the statistical analysis to see kind of what values we'd get. So we're hoping to take a mixture of oxides that would be both one mixture that would be more similar structures, so a structure that was very similar to UO2, and then another that would be more different from UO2, so that we could see sort of a range that we might expect. And so with that kind of taste of some of the stuff that we're working on to try to solve some of these problems moving forward, there are some challenges to characterizing uranium oxide particles based on these different parameters that we've mentioned, that we are using an analytical approach. So really kind of trying to hone in on analytical chemistry and the skills and tools related to analytical chemistry towards quantifying the suitability of XAFS for routine characterization of these materials and figuring out to what extent we would be able to tell if there were higher oxides present or not. And that this approach involves a combination of theory and experiment, mostly in the mode of simulations versus experimental data, in order to determine what the detection limit or estimate what that might be for higher oxides of uranium within UO2. And this is a test system, I should mention, but I imagine that there are many different systems within the community that could potentially benefit from knowing kind of the realm of thresholds that we might see in our system. We are very invested in uranium oxides, which is why we are exploring this with uranium oxides. And then a last item is that we aim to develop characterization approaches based on acknowledging the advantages and disadvantages that our toolbox has. So we really would like to be able to say with what degree of statistical evidence we are confident in the results that we are reporting. And with that, just acknowledge the many people at Berkeley Lab that helped the kind of the first section of our talk related to that data, in particular our synthetic team. So I was working primarily under Corbin Booth, but also very closely with Stefan Manassian, having some involvement in both aspects of the work. And then also the many folks who helped us with the many different characterization tools that we used in that study. And then at Washington State University, most of the work has been done simulation-wise by myself at this point, but there are PhD students who've been involved and an undergraduate as well with the synthesis of some of our uranium oxide particles. And I should note that the student Ashley Knapp has been involved in XAFS analysis of some of our collaborators' uranium oxide systems to be involved also in this work, as well as our collaborators who've led their expertise into some of our synthetic methodology as well. Also to Professor John McCloy, who has offered to be making the bulk uranium oxides that we will be using in the study that I mentioned today, since we do not have that bulk oxide synthetic expertise within our own group. And so we're grateful to have that expertise as well. And also I wanted to acknowledge that this project has been made possible through some seed grant funding through the Washington State University Office of Research Advancement and Partnerships. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions that you guys might have at this stage.
Thank you. That was terrific. We've got a few questions, and then we'll be at our end of time. To start, Yang Ha, can you ask your question?
Yeah, I was talking to you as you to see the progress you have made so far. So my question is, your current research using like hard X-ray more focus on the geometric structures. And I wonder if you have any ideas on evaluating the electronic structures, because eventually people are interested in these nanoparticles, are interested in their reactivities.
Right, that's true. That you know, there's going to be a combination of you know, radial structure having things to do with the properties as well as the electronic structure. Electronic structure wise, at least for the uranium oxides, again, going to more of the higher energy resolution fluorescence detection, I think would give us some good picture on what that looks like, as well as we like to use magnetism, so SWID magnetometry, to look at differences in the electronic structure of these different constructs. So those are not things I talked about within this talk, but are definitely things that we are planning to do in the future as we move forward with these systems. I definitely agree that the electronic structures are things that folks are interested in, and we're certainly interested in not only with these systems, but also in kind of mixed oxide or mixed materials systems, what those look like.
Okay, Peter Botts, you had a question?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, that was really interesting. I really liked as well that, how you used the crystalline bulk structures of the higher oxidation state to try and figure out what's happening in your systems. But as you're looking at nanoparticles, I was wondering if you looked at either nanoparticulate uranate phases or nanoclusters from uranyl peroxides to try and figure out what happens in your system and whether you've got higher oxidation state uranium in your nanoparticles.
Well, thank you. That's a really good point in considering the uranyl peroxide clusters. That is something that we've, you know, thought about in the context of at least the systems that will have some water interface, because that would be, you know, relevant to these systems. In the case of these that we've made, I think the reason we're mostly looking at the bulk oxides is based on the first question of, you know, in these more extended solids, what are we expecting to have or to make? We have definitely gotten the question before of, do you have clusters or do you have nanoparticles? Clusters being something that has actually a defined elemental composition that we can actually define. In our case, we think we have nanoparticles due to the polydispersity that we're seeing. We're not really seeing a bimodal, trimodal system. However, you know, I do think, especially as we move towards aqueous systems, that we will be looking a lot more into the types of systems that you have mentioned, because they also could definitely be relevant. So this is one aspect of the problem that we're needing to look at, and I think would be more relevant towards certain systems that we're working with. But this isn't going to be able to solve all of the problem. We are definitely going to need to look into the systems that you're describing as well.
Yeah, with aqueous systems, I would definitely at least look at especially the uranate phases.
For sure. I definitely agree.